Why didn't she fight back when they first dragged her to her knees? That was the question that would haunt the after-action reports later. The question whispered in hallways. The question typed into sealed transcripts by men who had never felt a rifle barrel press against their spine in a dark room. But in that moment, Lieutenant Rachel Kellerman wasn't thinking about reports. She was thinking about air. The blindfold smelled like oil and old canvas. Her wrists were bound behind her back with plastic restraints pulled just tight enough to numb her fingers. The floor beneath her knees was concrete, cold despite the desert heat still clinging to the night. She kept her breathing slow. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Fear was loud, panic was louder, but discipline was silent. And silence kept you alive. Somewhere in the room, boots shifted. A metal chair scraped across concrete. A low laugh followed. You Navy types always think you're special. Rachel didn't answer. Because she wasn't here to argue. She wasn't here to win a debate. She was here because she had chosen to walk into a trap. And she had chosen it knowing the cost. 3 hours earlier, she'd stood in front of the mirror in her quarters, adjusting the watch on her wrist, the one modified to transmit audio. She looked at her reflection and asked herself a simple question. Are you doing this because you're angry or because it's right? The difference mattered. Anger was reckless, righteousness was steady. She had seen the corkboard, the degrading photos, the smirks that followed her down hallways. She had read the transfer papers of women who had once worn this uniform proudly, women who now avoided eye contact when they crossed base property as civilians. She had felt the old, familiar ache of being underestimated. Desert Storm had taught her how to lie still for 6 hours in a sandstorm, waiting for a single shot. Scout Sniper School had taught her how to compartmentalize pain. But this was different. This wasn't an enemy across a battlefield. This was rot from within. The blindfold tightened suddenly as someone yanked it upward for a second, just enough to let fluorescent light stab into her eyes before dropping it back down. A test. They wanted to see flinching, tears, defiance. She gave them nothing. One of them crouched close. She could smell stale coffee and chewing tobacco. You think Brennan's coming for you. There it was, the bait. They were watching for reaction. Rachel let her head tilt slightly, as if confused, as if uncertain. Inside, her mind was running calculations. Time since entry, 14 minutes. Audio transmission active. Backup response window, variable. She flexed her wrist subtly, feeling the tension in the restraints, testing slack, measuring angle. They thought the restraints were the weapon. They didn't realize her stillness was. Another voice from across the room, deeper, confident. You made us look bad in front of the unit. That wasn't smart. There was resentment there, bruised ego, entitlement. Rachel recognized the tone. She had heard it in Iraq when insurgents realized the woman with the rifle had just outshot them. She had heard it in briefings when senior officers politely questioned whether she was emotionally suited for long-term deployments. She had heard it from men who confused dominance with strength. And every time, she had responded the same way. By surviving. A hand gripped her jaw, forcing her face upward. You're not in control here. Her pulse spiked. Not from fear. From opportunity. Because control is rarely about who's standing. It's about who's thinking. She let her breathing quicken just a fraction, enough to sell the moment. Inside, she began counting. 1, 2, 3. They were close now, too close, overconfident. One of them stepped behind her. The grip on her jaw loosened slightly. Plastic restraints cut into her skin as she twisted, not violently, but precisely. She shifted her weight backward, driving her shoulder into the knee of the man behind her. He stumbled. That half-second of imbalance was everything. Rachel rolled hard to her right, dragging her bound wrists beneath her legs in one fluid motion she had practiced 100 times in seer training. Pain shot through her shoulders as joints strained, but she didn't hesitate. The blade hidden in the seam of her waistband slipped into her fingers. A flick, a cut. The plastic snapped. The room erupted. Grab her. Boots thundered, hands lunged. Rachel surged upward from her knees like a release spring, slamming her elbow into the throat of the nearest body. A sharp gasp, a body falling. Another grabbed her shoulder. She pivoted, drove her forehead into his nose. Bone met bone. He howled. The blindfold tore free as she ripped it away, eyes adjusting instantly. 3 men. One by the door, one scrambling to his feet, one stunned on the ground. No firearms drawn. They hadn't expected resistance. That was their mistake. She moved low and fast, sweeping the legs of the man nearest the exit before he could block it. He crashed into the doorframe. She didn't stay to finish. Because real operators don't fight for revenge. They fight for space. She burst into the hallway. Alarm lights flashed red. Voices shouted behind her. Her lungs burned as she sprinted down the corridor, turning corners from memory. She had walked this building earlier, counted doors, measured distances. Never walk into a room you haven't already mapped in your head. Behind her, footsteps gained. She cut left through a maintenance stairwell instead of the main exit, up 2 flights, across a catwalk, through an unlocked supply door. Disorientation was a weapon. So was unpredictability. At the end of the corridor, she skidded into the open air of the loading dock. Cool desert night hit her skin like freedom. A truck engine roared somewhere behind the building. They were mobilizing. She vaulted over a low railing, dropped 8 feet into gravel, rolled to absorb impact. Pain flared in her ankle. Ignore it. Move. She ran toward the tree line beyond the perimeter fence. Not away from them. Toward terrain. Because terrain equalized everything. A shot cracked in the distance, warning, not aimed. They didn't want to kill her. They wanted silence. Rachel hit the fence at full speed, climbed with boots finding links in practiced rhythm, and dropped to the other side. The desert swallowed her. For the first time since the blindfold tightened, she allowed herself a single thought. Good. Because now the battlefield belonged to her. She moved through scrub and shadow until base lights were distant glows behind her. Only then did she slow. Only then did her hands begin to shake. Adrenaline always waited until you were safe to demand its toll. She crouched behind a rock formation, breathing hard, listening. No engines nearby. No pursuit in immediate proximity. She touched the watch on her wrist. The transmitter was cracked but intact. If Brennan had been listening, and she believed he had, then the next phase had already begun. She leaned her head back against stone and closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Not in relief. In resolve. They thought she was prey. They thought humiliation would silence her. They thought fear would make her disappear like the others. They were wrong. Because strength isn't loud. It isn't rage. It isn't even dominance. Sometimes strength is simply refusing to break. Rachel opened her eyes and stared at the horizon where dawn would eventually rise. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. And somewhere behind her, men who had always hunted in packs were about to learn what it felt like to be tracked. Sometimes survival isn't about overpowering your enemy. Sometimes it's about enduring long enough to become the hunter. How far can a person run before the shaking stops? Rachel didn't know the answer. She only knew that When the first hint of dawn touched the desert horizon, her legs were still moving, even though the base lights were miles behind her. She slowed only when instinct told her she'd created enough distance to think. Thinking was survival. She ducked behind a jagged rock formation, chest rising and falling in controlled pulls. The desert air was cold now, almost kind, a contrast to the heat that had pressed against her skin inside that concrete room. Her wrists were raw, her ankle throbbed from the drop off the loading dock. But she was alive, and that changed everything. She pressed 2 fingers against the cracked watch face. "Chief," she whispered, "if you're hearing this, Phase 2. Static answered. Then faint, distorted, a voice she recognized. "Copy, Lieutenant. Maintain position. We're moving." Relief flickered through her. Not comfort. Confirmation. Brennan had heard enough. Which meant the trap had closed, even if not exactly how planned. Rachel leaned her head back against the rock and closed her eyes for a second. The memory tried to creep in, the blindfold, the grip on her jaw, the laughter. She cut it off. Compartmentalize. Later. Feel it later. Right now she needed clarity. She replayed every second. The overconfidence, the lack of firearms, the hesitation when she broke free. They hadn't expected resistance. That told her something critical. They had done this before. And before tonight, no one had fought back. That realization settled heavy in her chest. Not fear. Grief. For women who hadn't had the warning signs she'd spotted. For women who hadn't had backup staged. For women who had believed they were alone. Rachel wasn't alone. But she almost had been. Her ankle pulsed sharply as she shifted position. She peeled off her boot and inspected it in the faint dawn light. Swollen, not broken. She wrapped it tight with gauze from the small emergency kit strapped to her calf. Hands steady, movements efficient. Pain was information. Information was useful. She scanned the horizon. Dust plume. Vehicle. 2 trucks splitting wide. They weren't searching randomly. They were hunting. Her jaw tightened. Good. Let them hunt. She moved deeper into the desert, keeping low, using the terrain like she had used dunes in Kuwait. She wasn't trying to outrun them anymore. She was repositioning. She found a shallow depression near a dry wash and settled into it, covering herself lightly with brush. From here, she could see the access road. 1 truck roared past, too fast, scanning outward. The second slowed. Smart. They were learning. Rachel slowed her breathing until her chest barely moved. In sniper school, she had once lain still while ants crawled across her neck for 2 hours. The instructor had whispered afterward, "Stillness isn't passive, it's control." She remembered that now. The truck idled 50 yards away. Doors opened. Boots on gravel. 2 silhouettes stepped out. One of them limped slightly. The one she had dropped at the doorway. He wasn't laughing anymore. They scanned the brush lazily at first. Then more carefully. Rachel felt her heart thud once hard against her ribs. If they found her before Brennan arrived, things would escalate. And she had already seen how fast desperation turned ugly. A voice drifted across the desert air. "She can't have gone far. She's hurt. She's scared." Rachel almost smiled. They needed her scared. Because if she wasn't afraid, then they were. The limping one stepped closer to her position. 20 yards. 15. 10. Rachel's hand slipped to the small stone beside her. Not as a weapon. As a distraction. She waited until he turned slightly, scanning left. Then she threw the stone hard in the opposite direction. It clattered against a rock outcrop. Both men spun. Over there. They moved toward the sound. Rachel didn't hesitate. She rolled silently in the opposite direction, using their own momentum to widen her gap. Within seconds she was 30 yards away. Then 50. Then gone. Behind her, shouts erupted when they realized the deception. She kept moving. Not sprinting. Flowing. She reached the edge of a dry ravine and dropped into it, following the winding cut in the earth. Natural cover. Limited vehicle access. Advantage hers. Her mind drifted briefly, unwanted, to the moment inside the room when Garrison's hand tightened at her throat. For 1 second she had felt the edge, the razor-thin line between control and chaos. And she had almost lost it. The realization didn't scare her. It humbled her. Strength wasn't invincibility. It was the willingness to stand up again, even after your breath was taken. Her phone vibrated once in her pocket. Encrypted message. Tours in position. Base lockdown initiated. Garrison detained. Brooks missing. Webb cooperating. Rachel exhaled slowly. So that was it. They had fractured. The pack was splitting. She typed back quickly. 2 in field, 1 limping, likely Brooks. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Stay dark, do not engage. Rachel almost laughed. Stay dark. As if that wasn't what she had been her entire career. She followed the ravine for another half-mile before climbing out onto a ridge that overlooked the highway access point to base. She crouched there watching. Minutes later, military police vehicles screamed down the road toward the desert access. Then another set unmarked. NCIS. Brennan didn't waste time. The trucks below slowed, confused by the sudden influx of law enforcement. One reversed abruptly. The other stalled in hesitation. And that was when the floodlights came on. From 3 directions. The desert lit up like noon. Commands barked over loudspeakers. Exit the vehicle, hands visible. Rachel watched from her ridge as the men who had hunted her froze. Predators forced into daylight. One tried to run. He didn't get far. Within seconds, both were on the ground. Cuffed. Controlled. She stayed where she was until the dust settled. Until the sirens faded into procedural calm. Only then did she rise. Her ankle protested sharply now that adrenaline had thinned. She walked not toward the trucks, but along the ridge, circling back toward the main road where Brennan stood near an NCIS SUV. He spotted her before she called out. For a man in his 60s, he moved fast. He reached her just as she stepped onto asphalt. For a second, neither of them spoke. He looked her over, assessing injuries the way operators did. You good? She nodded once. Ankle pried, nothing permanent. He studied her face carefully. You kept your head. I almost didn't. Honesty. It mattered. Brennan's eyes softened slightly. Almost doesn't count. Behind them, agents escorted Brooks, nose swollen, face furious toward a vehicle. He caught sight of Rachel. Hatred burned in his expression. But beneath it, fear. She held his gaze without flinching. He looked away first. Brennan followed her line of sight. They'll lawyer up. I know. They'll say you provoked it. I know. He paused. You ready for that? Rachel considered the question. Not the legal fight. The personal one. The whispers, the doubt, the subtle shift in how people looked at her. She inhaled slowly. I didn't run because I was scared, Chief. I ran because it gave us leverage. He gave a slow nod. That's the difference between survival and strategy. They stood there as dawn finally crested over the horizon, turning the sky pale gold. Rachel felt exhaustion creeping now, deep bone level. The shaking had returned. Not from fear. From release. She wrapped her arms around herself briefly, steadying. Brennan noticed. "You want to talk about it?" She looked out at the desert. "Later." He didn't push. Because he understood. Sometimes strength is loud and decisive. Sometimes it's quiet and delayed. Sometimes you survive first. Then you feel. As medical staff approached to check her ankle, Rachel let her eyes drift once more toward the ravine where she had hidden. She hadn't won tonight. Not completely. But she had changed something. They had expected silence. They had expected compliance. They had expected fear to shrink her. Instead, she had moved. Adapted. Outlasted. And in doing so, she had shifted the balance. The desert wind lifted gently around them, carrying dust and the faint scent of morning. Rachel closed her eyes for a brief second and let one truth settle fully in her chest. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the refusal to let fear decide the ending. And this story was far from over. What does it cost to become the reason everything changes? Rachel didn't feel like a hero when she stepped into the base medical clinic that morning. She felt tired, bruised, exposed. The adrenaline was gone. Now came the aftermath. A corpsman wrapped her ankle while asking routine questions in a voice that tried too hard to sound normal. On a scale of 1 to 10. 4, she answered. It was closer to 7. But she had learned long ago that pain was easier to manage than pity. Across the room, 2 junior sailors pretended not to stare. News had already spread. It always did. Bases were small ecosystems. Whispers traveled faster than official reports. She fought back. They tried to grab her. NCIS is involved. No one said the word assault out loud. They never did. Brennan stood by the door, arms folded, expression unreadable. He wasn't hovering, he was anchoring. A silent presence that told the room she wasn't alone. When the corpsman finished, Rachel slid off the exam table. "Clear for duty?" she asked. The corpsman hesitated. "Technically, you should rest for 48 hours. Rachel nodded once. "Noted." Outside, the sun was fully up now, sharp and unforgiving. The base looked the same as it had yesterday, same flags snapping in the wind, same vehicles moving with purpose. But something underneath had shifted. You could feel it. Torres met them outside the clinic, tablet tucked under her arm. Brooks is in custody. Webb's already talking. Garrison's lawyer is demanding to see the evidence. Rachel didn't react. Good. Let him see it. Torres studied her carefully. You understand what today looks like, right? Rachel did. Interviews, statements, review boards, quiet conversations behind closed doors. And scrutiny. Lots of scrutiny. Yeah, she said. Torres lowered her voice. They're going to try to flip the narrative, say you were reckless, that you escalated, that you endangered yourself to provoke a response. I know. Are you ready for that? Rachel thought back to the desert ravine, to the moment she chose to move instead of hide. I didn't provoke anything, she said evenly. I exposed it. Torres gave a slow nod. Then hold that line. By noon, she was seated in a conference room that felt colder than necessary. 3 senior officers, 1 JAG representative, a recorder in the center of the table. Procedure. Neutral faces. Controlled voices. Lieutenant Kellerman, walk us through your decision to enter the training facility after hours. Rachel folded her hands calmly in front of her. I had credible information suggesting ongoing misconduct and an imminent attempt to coerce or threaten my career. I coordinated with NCIS and Master Chief Brennan prior to entry. You knowingly entered a potentially dangerous environment. Yes, sir. Why? She held the Admiral's gaze. Because the pattern indicated escalation, and because waiting would have meant another victim. Silence. Pen scratched lightly on paper. One of the officers leaned back slightly. You're aware that had this gone differently, you might not be sitting here. Yes, sir. And you accepted that risk. I did. He studied her face carefully. Why? The room felt still. Rachel didn't rush the answer. Because I've seen what happens when people don't. The words hung there. No theatrics, no raised voice. Just truth. By late afternoon, exhaustion began creeping into her bones, the kind that no amount of physical conditioning could prevent. This wasn't combat fatigue. This was emotional. Every time she retold the story, she felt it again, the blindfold, the grip at her throat, the decision to move. Not fear. Memory. In the hallway outside the conference room, a young female ensign stopped her. Ma'am. Rachel turned. The ensign looked barely 22. I wanted to say thank you. Rachel's expression softened slightly. For what? For not letting it stay normal. The words hit harder than any punch. Rachel studied her. You okay? The ensign hesitated, then nodded. For now. Rachel gave a small, steady nod in return. If that ever changes, don't wait. The ensign swallowed, then squared her shoulders slightly. Yes, ma'am. As she walked away, Rachel felt something shift again. This wasn't just about stopping 3 men. It was about altering expectation. That evening, she finally allowed herself to sit alone. Her quarters were quiet. The bass outside had settled into muted night rhythms. She unstrapped the watch from her wrist and placed it on the desk. The cracked face stared back at her. Proof. Evidence. Survival. She stared at her reflection in the darkened window. There was a faint bruise forming near her jaw, finger-shaped. She touched it lightly. Her hand trembled. And this time she didn't stop it. The shaking came from somewhere deeper than adrenaline. It came from knowing how close she had been. From realizing that control can vanish in a heartbeat. From understanding that bravery doesn't always feel strong in the moment. Sometimes it feels fragile. She sank onto the edge of her bunk and let herself breathe through it. 1 breath. 2. 3. No tears. Not because she wasn't affected, but because she was processing it her way. After a few minutes, there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Brennan standing there, holding 2 cups of coffee. Figured you hadn't eaten, he said. She stepped aside to let him in. They sat across from each other in silence for a while. Finally, he spoke. You did good today. She looked down at the cup in her hands. I got lucky. No, he said firmly, you were prepared. She exhaled slowly. I keep replaying it, that second when I couldn't breathe. He didn't interrupt. I thought just for a second, what if I miscalculated? Brennan nodded once. That's called being human. She met his eyes. Did it ever get easier? He leaned back slightly. No. Honest. It gets clearer. You trust your training more, but the cost, that part stays. She absorbed that. The cost stays. But you learned something, he continued. Courage isn't about not feeling it, it's about moving anyway. Rachel stared at the cracked watch on her desk. I wasn't brave because I wasn't scared, she said quietly. Brennan nodded. You were brave because you were. Silence settled between them again. Not heavy. Grounded. After a moment he stood. Admiral Richardson arrives tomorrow. I heard. He's old school, but he respects results. And if he does... Brennan's eyes held something steady. Then we make it expensive not to. A faint smile tugged at her mouth. Strategy. Not ego. He moved toward the door. Get some rest, Lieutenant. Tomorrow won't be quieter. When he left, Rachel lay back on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. Her body ached. Her mind replayed. But beneath all of it was something steady. Not pride. Not triumph. Purpose. They had tried to make her small. They had tried to make fear the defining moment. Instead, she had chosen movement. Chosen exposure. Chosen consequence. Outside, somewhere in the dark, a desert wind moved softly through the trees. Rachel closed her eyes. Tomorrow, the brass would decide her career. The press might get wind of the investigation. Lawyers would argue. Reputations would fracture. But none of that mattered as much as one quiet truth she now carried with certainty. Silence protects predators. Action protects people. And sometimes dignity doesn't shout. It simply refuses to kneel. What happens when the story stops being about what they did and starts being about who you are? Rachel felt that shift the moment Admiral Richardson stepped onto the base. Not because of his rank. Because of the silence that followed him. Command presence wasn't about volume. It was about gravity, and the Admiral carried it like weather. By 800 she was back in uniform, ankle taped tight, bruise at her jaw faintly visible despite concealer. She had considered covering it more carefully. Then she hadn't. Let them see it. Not as spectacle. As fact. The conference room was fuller this time. Legal counsel, senior officers, NCIS representatives. The atmosphere felt less procedural and more political. Admiral Richardson sat at the head of the table, hands folded, expression unreadable. Lieutenant Kellerman, he began, voice calm, I've reviewed the preliminary reports. She stood straight. Yes, sir. You coordinated with NCIS prior to entry. Yes, sir. You understood the risk. Yes, sir. His eyes lingered on the faint bruise near her jaw. And you proceeded anyway. Yes, sir. A long pause followed. The kind designed to test composure. Rachel let it stretch. Inside, she felt the old familiar tension, the one she'd carried her entire career. The quiet pressure of being observed differently, evaluated not just on performance but on presence, on whether she belonged. Ignored at briefings, second-guessed in debriefs, praised carefully as if success were surprising. She had swallowed that tension for years. Today she didn't swallow it. She stood with it. Richardson leaned back slightly. You've caused quite a disruption. There it was. Not accusation. Assessment. Rachel answered carefully. Sir, the disruption already existed. I documented it. A few eyes shifted around the table. The Admiral studied her longer now. 3 men face court-martial. 1 has already requested discharge in lieu of trial. You understand the ripple effect this will have. Yes, sir. Recruitment optics, public relations, internal morale. She held his gaze. Respectfully, sir, morale suffers more when misconduct is tolerated. The air tightened. Not hostile. Focused. Richardson's jaw flexed slightly. And you believe tolerance was occurring. Rachel didn't hesitate. Yes, sir. Silence again. This time heavier. Torres shifted slightly in her seat but said nothing. Richardson finally nodded once. Very well. He turned to the JAG officer. Proceed. The tension didn't vanish, but it changed, and Rachel felt it. A current beneath the surface. Later in the hallway, two senior chiefs avoided her eyes. One younger petty officer gave her a subtle nod. The base was dividing. Change always did that. By midday, word had spread beyond the base. An investigative inquiry, allegations of coercion, internal misconduct review. No names publicly released yet. But the machine had started turning. Rachel sat alone in the locker room for a moment before afternoon drills. The room was empty, fluorescent lights humming overhead. She stared at her reflection again. She didn't look like a symbol. She looked tired. And underneath the fatigue, something else pressed quietly against her ribs. Doubt. Not about what she'd done. About what it would cost long-term. Special operations communities were tight, tribal. Loyalty ran deep, sometimes deeper than accountability. Would she always be the one who brought heat? Would teammates hesitate before trusting her? Would doors close quietly later? The thoughts weren't dramatic. They were practical. And they hurt more than the bruise. The door opened. Tors stepped inside. You hiding? Thinking. Tors leaned against a locker. They're spinning already. Rachel gave a faint smile. I figured. Some are calling you reckless. Of course. Others are calling you brave. Rachel's smile faded. I'm neither. Tors tilted her head. No. Rachel shook her head slowly. I was tired of pretending it wasn't happening. Tors studied her carefully. That's not recklessness. Rachel exhaled. It's not heroism either. No, Tors agreed softly. It's responsibility. The words settled differently. Responsibility. Not glory. Not rebellion. Just duty expanded. Rachel absorbed that. Because responsibility felt steady. Less fragile than bravery. That evening, she attended a unit meeting. No speeches. No ceremony. Just routine updates. But the atmosphere was unmistakably altered. Eyes lingered longer. Conversations paused when she entered. She felt it, that quiet recalibration of identity. She wasn't just Lieutenant Kellerman anymore. She was a variable. A reminder. Midway through the briefing, a senior enlisted man cleared his throat. Permission to speak freely, sir. The commanding officer nodded. He turned slightly toward Rachel. Ma'am, some of us didn't see it. What was happening, not fully. The room stilled. He continued. That's on us too. Rachel didn't expect that. Accountability rarely came voluntarily. I'm not here to make enemies, she said evenly. I'm here to make sure the uniform means something. The words surprised even her. But once spoken, they felt right. The uniform means something. Not power. Not dominance. Integrity. After the meeting, a few approached quietly. Not dramatically. Just thoughtfully. Questions, clarifications, conversations that should have happened months ago. Change wasn't explosive. It was incremental. Messy. Human. Late that night, Rachel returned to the ridge overlooking the desert. Her ankle protested less now. The sky was clear, stars scattered like distant signals. She stood there alone, boots planted in sand, and let herself feel it. Not the fear. Not the anger. The weight. Because action had consequences beyond arrests. It altered ecosystems. And ecosystems resisted. She wondered briefly What would have happened if she'd stayed silent? If she'd transferred quietly? If she'd let it slide like others had been forced to? Her career might have remained smoother, quieter, safer. But somewhere, another woman would have knelt in that room. The thought tightened her jaw. A soft wind moved across the ridge. She closed her eyes. Strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refused to cooperate with wrong. A vibration buzzed in her pocket. Message from Brennan. Richardson approved external oversight review, permanent. Rachel stared at the screen. Permanent. That wasn't small. That wasn't cosmetic. That was structural. She typed back. Understood. A second message followed. You okay? She considered the question honestly. Was she? She was tired. She was uncertain. She was aware that some doors might close quietly in the future. But she was also steady. Yes, she typed. Then, after a moment, I am. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and looked out across the dark desert. This wasn't a triumphant chapter. There were no medals, no applause. Just paperwork, consequences, conversations. But something fundamental had shifted. Not just in policy, in posture. And she realized something quietly profound. They had tried to make her small in a room with no windows. Instead, she had stepped into open air. And open air changes how you breathe. The wind moved again, gentle against her face. Rachel stood there until the stars blurred slightly, not from tears, but from exhaustion finally catching up. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more scrutiny, more subtle tests of loyalty and resilience. But tonight, she allowed herself one simple acknowledgement. Courage doesn't always feel powerful. Sometimes it feels inconvenient. Sometimes it feels lonely. But when you stand long enough, others begin to stand too. And that's how culture shifts, not in headlines but in posture. Not in noise but in refusal. Sometimes dignity doesn't argue. It just refuses to bend. What if the hardest part isn't fighting back, but living with what it cost you? 3 weeks passed. On paper, it looked like progress. Formal charges filed, oversight committee installed, anonymous reporting channels restructured, training protocols updated, a briefing circulated with the words "zero tolerance" in bold. On the surface, the base appeared cleaner, sharper, corrected. But culture doesn't change in bullet points. It changes in glances, in pauses, in who sits next to you at lunch. Rachel felt it in the gym first. The usual rhythm of clanging weights and low music continued, but conversations softened when she entered. Not hostile, not openly. Just careful. 2 operators who used to train beside her now kept their distance, not because they hated her, because she made them think. And thinking can feel like accusation. She told herself she was imagining it. Then one afternoon, she overheard it. She could have handled it internally. She didn't have to torch the whole unit. Torch. The word landed heavier than expected. She kept walking. Didn't confront. Didn't react. But later that night, alone in her quarters, it echoed. Torch. Was that how they saw it? Like she'd burned something down instead of clearing it. She sat at her desk, staring at the cracked watch still resting there, evidence logged, returned for personal retention after documentation. She ran her thumb along the fracture line. There was a version of this story where she had stayed quiet, where she'd accepted the apology that would have eventually come, the quiet reassignment, the handshake behind closed doors. In that version, the unit remained intact, untouched, comfortable, and wrong. She leaned back in her chair, and let the doubt rise fully this time. Had she fractured something essential? Special operations thrived on cohesion, on trust so deep it bordered on instinct. And now some of that trust had hairline cracks. Not because she lied, because she exposed. A knock interrupted her spiral. She opened the door to find the young ensign from the hallway weeks ago. The one who had said thank you. Her name tag read, Ensign Park. "Ma'am, do you have a minute?" Rachel stepped aside. Park entered cautiously, hands clasped behind her back. "I won't take long," she said quickly. I needed to tell you something." Rachel waited. "There's been a shift in my division," Park continued. "Small things, comments that used to slide, they don't anymore." Rachel studied her carefully. "Good shift." "Yes, ma'am." Park swallowed. "And some of the guys who were closest to Brooks, they've been different, quieter, watching what they say." Rachel nodded once. Accountability feels uncomfortable at first. Park hesitated. "Does it ever stop feeling like you're the problem?" That question cut clean. Rachel didn't rush the answer. "Yes," she said finally, "but not because they change overnight." "Then why?" "Because you stop measuring yourself by their comfort." Park absorbed that slowly. "I just didn't want you to think it didn't matter." Rachel felt something tighten in her chest, not pain, something warmer. "It matters," she said softly. After Park left, Rachel sat back down. Torch. Maybe she had burned something. But maybe it was rot. The difference wasn't always visible immediately. The court-martial proceedings began quietly. No cameras. No press conference. Just testimony, cross-examination, strategy. Rachel sat in uniform and recounted the night again. Steady voice. Precise details. No dramatics. Defense counsel attempted subtle reframing. "You willingly entered the facility after hours." "Yes." "You engaged physically with my client." "Yes." "You struck him first." She held the attorney's gaze. "I acted to prevent further physical control." The attorney nodded, as if that answered something larger. "You're highly trained in close-quarters combat, correct?" "Yes." "So your response was significant." Rachel didn't flinch. "My response was proportionate to the threat." A pause. "You weren't afraid." There it was. The implication. If she wasn't visibly terrified, perhaps it wasn't severe. Rachel answered honestly. "I was afraid." The room shifted slightly. "But fear doesn't negate reality," she continued. "It clarifies it." The defense attorney leaned back. No further questions. Afterward, in the quiet hallway outside the courtroom, she felt it hit her. Not adrenaline. Not anger. Exhaustion. The kind that seeps into your bones when you've had to prove something over and over. Not that it happened. That it mattered. Brennan joined her near the exit. "You held the line," he said. She gave a faint smile. "I'm tired of holding it." He nodded slowly. "Good." She looked at him. "Good. Means you're human. If this didn't wear on you, I'd worry." She exhaled. "Some days I feel like I detonated something." Brennan considered that. "Maybe," he said, "but sometimes you have to breach a wall before you can rebuild." She stared at the concrete floor for a moment. "And if the rebuilding takes years?" "It will." No sugarcoating. She appreciated that. But later that week, something unexpected happened. One of the operators who had kept his distance approached her after a training evolution. Petty Officer Reyes. He shifted awkwardly, helmet tucked under his arm. "Ma'am." "Yes, Reyes." He hesitated. My sister in the army. Rachel waited. She called me after the news broke, said she'd never heard of someone doing what you did. Rachel felt her guard lift slightly. Ray's cleared his throat. I didn't get it at first, why you went that route. And now, she asked evenly. He met her eyes. Now I do. It wasn't dramatic. No apology speech. Just recalibration. It was enough. As he walked away, Rachel felt something inside her settle. Change wasn't applause. It was incremental. Human. Messy. And sometimes invisible until someone said one quiet sentence. Now I do. That night, she returned to the ridge again. It had become ritual. The desert stretched endlessly before her, unchanged by courtrooms or policy shifts. Wind brushed lightly against her uniform. She thought about cohesion, about trust, about whether the unit would ever feel the same. Maybe it wouldn't. Maybe it shouldn't. Because cohesion built on silence wasn't strength. It was illusion. And illusions crack under pressure. She inhaled deeply. The cost had been real. Isolation, scrutiny, doubt, fatigue. But the alternative would have cost more. Her integrity. Someone else's safety. The quiet erosion of meaning in the uniform she wore. She closed her eyes briefly. For the first time in weeks, she didn't replay the room. She didn't replay the grip at her jaw or the sprint into the desert. Instead, she pictured the ensign standing a little straighter. Ray's making a call to his sister. The oversight committee becoming permanent. Small shifts. Subtle realignments. She realized something then. Breaking free hadn't been the hardest part. Living visibly afterward was. But visibility was the point. You can't change a culture from the shadows forever. Sometimes you have to step into open ground and accept that not everyone will clap. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at her sleeves. Rachel looked out across the horizon, where the last light was fading. She wasn't proud in the cinematic sense. She was steady, and steadiness was enough. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't winning the fight. It's staying when it would be easier to disappear. What if freedom isn't the moment you break loose, but the moment you stop carrying what they try to put on you? The verdict came down on a Thursday. No spectacle, no cameras lined up outside the courtroom doors, just a quiet announcement in a room filled with uniforms and restrained breathing. Garrison dismissed from service, court-martial conviction. Brooks reduced rank, confinement discharge. Webb lesser charge, cooperation acknowledged, career effectively over. The words were procedural, clinical. But they landed with weight. Rachel sat still as the sentences were read, hands folded in her lap, spine straight, expression calm. Inside something loosened. Not triumph. Release. Afterward, people filtered out in small clusters. Some avoided eye contact. Some offered brief nods. A few held her gaze longer than before, not with tension, but with recognition. Brennan stepped beside her. "It's done," he said quietly. Rachel nodded once. "Yes." But it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a door closing behind her, and another one opening somewhere ahead. Outside, the air was sharp with late autumn wind. The desert didn't care about verdicts. It stretched wide and indifferent. Tours joined them near the steps. External oversight confirmed permanent, she said. New reporting chain bypasses direct unit command. Anonymous channels protected. Structural change. Not symbolic. Rachel absorbed that slowly. "Good," she said. Tours studied her face. "You okay?" The question again. It had followed her for weeks. This time she didn't hesitate. "I think so." And she meant it. But the days that followed were quieter than she expected. No dramatic backlash, no overt hostility. Instead, there was a subtle recalibration. In meetings, her voice carried differently now, not louder but steadier in the room's response. Questions directed at her were professional, not probing. During training exercises, teammates fell into rhythm beside her again, muscle memory of trust reasserting itself. Not everyone had changed, but enough had. One afternoon during a live-fire drill, Reyes moved into position at her flank without hesitation. Smooth, efficient. After the run, he bumped her shoulder lightly. "Good call on that left flank shift." Simple, normal, and normal felt extraordinary. But weeks later, she found herself back in the same training facility where it had begun. The room had been repainted, lighting adjusted, cameras installed at every angle. Transparency embedded into the architecture. She stood in the center of the concrete floor, boots planted where her knees had once hit cold ground. For a moment the memory flickered. Blindfold. Laughter. The tightening grip. Her breath shortened instinctively, just for a second. Then she inhaled slowly. The room didn't own her. The memory didn't define her. What they had tried to force onto her, shame, silence, diminishment, hadn't taken root. Because she hadn't carried it. That was the difference. The door opened behind her. Ensign Park stepped inside, now a little more confident in her stride. "Ma'am, inspection team's here." Rachel nodded. As they walked out together, Park glanced back at the room briefly. "They'll probably use this place as a case study," she said. "Maybe," Rachel replied. "Does it bother you?" Rachel considered that. "No." "Why not?" She stopped just outside the doorway and looked at Park. "Because if it helps someone else recognize the warning signs sooner, then it's not just a story, it's prevention." Park absorbed that quietly. They continued down the hall. But that evening, Rachel returned to the ridge one last time. The sky was heavy with stars, the desert cool and still. She stood there longer than usual. Not because she needed grounding. Because she wanted perspective. The past months had stripped something from her, illusions maybe. The idea that strength was purely physical. The belief that belonging meant staying quiet. In their place, something else had formed. Clarity. She thought about the question that had started everything. Why didn't she fight back immediately? The answer was simple now. Because timing matters. Because strategy matters. Because sometimes survival is not explosive, it's patient. She hadn't been passive. She had been calculating. She hadn't been silent. She had been gathering proof. And when she moved decisively. That was the lesson. Not rage. Not revenge. Intent. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket. A message from Brennan. "Admiral requested your name for leadership development track." She stared at the screen. Leadership. Not controversy. Not liability. Recognition. She typed back after a moment. "Copy." Then added. "Still a long road." His reply came quickly. "Good leaders walk long roads." She slipped the phone away and looked out over the dark horizon. The wind brushed gently against her uniform. She realized something then, something subtle but powerful. They had tried to reduce her to a moment. A room. An incident. But she was larger than that. Her career would not be defined by what they attempted. It would be defined by how she responded. And how she continued. Behind her, the base lights glowed softly in the distance. Within those buildings, new policies were being implemented. Conversations were happening that wouldn't have happened before. Junior officers were learning that silence wasn't required for survival. The shift wasn't dramatic. It was structural. And structural change lasts. Rachel closed her eyes briefly, breathing in the cool night air. The fear she had felt that first night no longer pulsed at the edges of her memory. It had transformed, not into anger, into understanding. Strength isn't about never being cornered. It's about refusing to stay there. It's about knowing when to endure, when to move, and when to stand visibly in the aftermath. The desert stretched endlessly before her, quiet and vast. She felt steady, not unscarred, not untouched, but unburdened, because the shame had never belonged to her. The silence had never been hers to carry, and the dignity they tried to strip away had never actually left. She turned from the ridge and began walking back toward the base lights, not as someone who had broken free, but as someone who had chosen to act. And sometimes, that's the quiet truth no one writes in reports. Courage doesn't always roar in the moment. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it calculates. And sometimes it simply refuses to kneel. Because dignity doesn't beg. It stands. And when it stands long enough, others learn how to stand beside it.